The letter was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home. Thick, cream-colored envelope, certified mail, the kind of thing that immediately makes your stomach tighten before you've even opened it. I remember standing there with dirt still on my boots from working outside all afternoon, staring at the logo of some law firm I'd never heard of, thinking maybe it was a mistake. It wasn't. According to the letter, I owed more than $5,000 in accumulated fines, penalties, late fees, and administrative costs. Apparently, if I didn't pay within 10 days, they planned to place a lien on my property. If that lien remained unpaid, they would begin legal proceedings that could eventually threaten ownership of the land my family had held for over 60 years. I must have read that paragraph 10 times because my brain simply refused to process it. $5,000 for what? A lien for what? I wasn't behind on taxes. I didn't owe any contractor money. I hadn't borrowed against the property. Then I saw the name that explained everything. Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was Valerie. Now before I explain who Valerie was and why she apparently thought she could take my family's farm away from me, you need to understand what this property means. My grandfather bought those 15 acres back in the early 60s, long before anyone imagined expensive subdivisions would start creeping out into the countryside. It's the kind of place where you can still hear crickets at night and actually see stars after sunset. The center of the property is a large workshop barn I built years ago. Nothing fancy, just steel walls, concrete floors, and enough space for me to restore old tractors, repair farm equipment, and disappear into projects whenever life gets too loud. Most people relax on golf courses. I relax covered in grease with a welding torch in one hand and a wrench in the other. For years, life was simple. Then developers bought the land directly east of me. Within months, construction crews arrived, roads were paved, and dozens of nearly identical houses started appearing. White siding, black trim, perfect landscaping. Every home looked like it had been copied and pasted from the same catalog. Along with the new neighborhood came something almost as predictable as sunrise, an HOA. I didn't care. Their rules didn't apply to me. My property existed decades before their development ever showed up. We were neighbors, nothing more. At least that's what I thought. The first time I met Valerie was on a Tuesday morning while I was rebuilding the hydraulic system on a vintage tractor. The barn doors were open. Music was playing quietly in the background. Everything was peaceful until I heard an unusual sound coming up my gravel driveway. Click, click, click. High heels. Nobody walks around farmland in high heels. The sound got closer until I finally looked up and saw a woman marching straight past multiple no trespassing signs as if they were decorative lawn ornaments. She didn't knock. She didn't introduce herself. She walked directly into my workshop like she owned the place. Mid-50s, expensive clothes, perfectly styled hair, and an expression that suggested the entire world existed solely to disappoint her. Before I could even ask who she was, she shoved a document into my hands and demanded I explain my illegal commercial activities. Illegal commercial activities. I actually laughed. I thought it had to be a joke. It wasn't. The paper claimed I was operating an unauthorized industrial business that violated community standards. According to Valerie, my welding projects, tractor restorations, and farm equipment maintenance were lowering nearby property values. The document demanded I cease operations immediately and pay a $500 fine. That's when she proudly introduced herself as president of the Cedar Ridge HOA. I calmly explained that I wasn't a member of her HOA. My land wasn't part of her neighborhood. My property was zoned agricultural. Everything I was doing was completely legal. I also explained that she was currently trespassing and needed to leave. Most reasonable people would have realized their mistake right there. Valerie wasn't most people. Instead, she smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile someone gives when they think they're about to win a fight. She informed me that adjacent properties had supposedly been absorbed into HOA authority when the development was established. That sentence alone told me she either had no idea what she was talking about or she was intentionally lying. Before leaving, she promised I'd be hearing from attorneys. Then she turned around and marched back down my driveway like she'd just delivered a royal decree. I stood there holding that ridiculous notice, wondering what alternate universe I had somehow wandered into. For a while I assumed it would blow over. It didn't. 1 week later, another fine arrived. Then another. Then another. 500 became 1,000. 1,000 became 1,500. Every letter sounded more threatening than the last. At first it was annoying. Then it became strange. Then it became dangerous. Because eventually I realized Valerie wasn't acting confused. She genuinely believed she could force me to obey rules that had absolutely nothing to do with me. And the worst part? She wasn't done yet. She was only getting started. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how these situations actually work. From a legal perspective, an HOA isn't some magical authority that can simply decide it owns neighboring property. In most cases, HOA power exists only because property owners voluntarily agree to it through recorded covenants tied to specific parcels of land. If your property isn't included in those recorded documents, the HOA generally has no jurisdiction over you, no matter how badly someone wants control. According to standard procedure, before any fine, violation, or enforcement action can happen, there has to be a clear legal connection between the homeowner and the association. That's why Valerie's behavior immediately raised red flags. But honestly, the legal side wasn't even the most interesting part. This is a psychological trap that shows up all the time when small amounts of authority go unchecked. Some people become so accustomed to controlling their environment that they start viewing independence itself as a threat. The moment they encounter someone outside their sphere of influence, they don't see a neighbor, they see a problem that needs to be brought under control. And trust me, what Valerie did next proved exactly that. Things escalated fast after that. The fines kept coming, sometimes 2 in the same week, each one more aggressive than the last. By that point I had stopped throwing them into a drawer and started organizing them into a folder because something about the whole situation felt wrong. Then county code enforcement showed up. That was the first moment I felt genuine concern. See, when a government truck pulls into your driveway, even if you've done nothing wrong, your pulse still jumps a little. The inspector stepped out carrying a clipboard and explained they had received complaints about illegal dumping, hazardous materials, and unauthorized commercial activity. I immediately knew where the complaint had come from. Still, I walked him through the entire property. I showed him permits, zoning documents, equipment records, everything. 15 minutes later, he closed his clipboard, looked around, and said, "Honestly, everything here looks fine." Then he lowered his voice slightly and added, "Between you and me, the complaint came from someone over in Cedar Ridge." That confirmed it. Valerie wasn't just sending fake fines anymore. She was actively trying to weaponize government agencies against me. Before leaving, the inspector gave me advice that would end up saving me later. Document everything. So I did. I installed cameras around the workshop, near the property line, and along the driveway. Within days, those cameras captured Valerie walking onto my land multiple times, taking photographs and wandering around areas she had absolutely no business being in. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Then came the letter from the attorneys. The one sitting on my kitchen table. The one threatening liens and foreclosure. That was the moment I stopped viewing Valerie as an annoying neighbor and started viewing her as a genuine threat. The next morning, I contacted a property attorney named Marcus Dalton. Marcus had the reputation of being the kind of lawyer who smiled while dismantling someone's entire case. After listening to my story for 20 minutes, he leaned back in his chair and actually laughed. "This may be the dumbest HOA overreach I've seen in years," he said. Then he told me not to respond emotionally. Instead, he wanted me to play dumb. His strategy was simple. We would politely ask the HOA for documentation proving I belong to their association. That's it. No threats. No accusations. Just a friendly request for evidence. A week later, we got our answer. And it was beautiful. The package they sent included HOA rules, violation summaries, highlighted regulations, and most importantly, a property map. The second Marcus unfolded that map, his eyebrows shot upward. Someone had literally taken a marker and drawn new HOA boundaries by hand. They had extended the association's jurisdiction right over my 15 acres. It looked like something a middle school student would create during detention. There was just one problem. Official county records already contained the real map. And the real map stopped exactly at my property line. Marcus stared at the document for several seconds before saying, "Well, they just handed us the case." That's when everything changed. He immediately filed a countersuit alleging harassment, trespassing, fraudulent property claims, and abuse of HOA authority. Copies were forwarded to state officials because falsifying property-related documentation can create serious legal consequences. Meanwhile, Valerie apparently had no idea what was coming. She was too busy convincing herself she was winning. A few weeks later, Marcus discovered the HOA board held monthly meetings open to residents and guests. He suggested I attend the next one. "Bring every document," he said, "and let her talk first." The meeting took place inside the community clubhouse. You know the type of place. Beige walls, generic artwork, folding chairs arranged in perfect rows. About 30 residents showed up. Most of them had probably never met me. I sat quietly in the back holding a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Then Valerie entered. She carried herself like a politician entering a campaign rally. Confident, smug, certain of victory. The meeting started with ordinary HOA business. Landscaping complaints, parking disputes, trash can violations. Then eventually Valerie reached the item she had clearly been waiting for. She announced there was a serious threat affecting the neighborhood. According to her, a nearby property owner was operating what she called an industrial facility disguised as a farm. She described dangerous machinery, excessive noise, environmental risks, declining property values. The way she told the story, you'd think I was running a steel mill next to a daycare center. Residents looked concerned. Some nodded along. Then Valerie pointed directly at me. "The property owner is here tonight," she announced. Perhaps he'd like to explain himself. You could almost hear the satisfaction in her voice. She thought she had created the perfect public ambush. So I stood up. Slowly, calmly, I walked to the front of the room and handed copies of my documents to every board member. Then I introduced myself. I explained that my family had owned the property since long before Cedar Ridge existed. I explained that the land was legally zoned agricultural. I explained that I had never signed HOA documents, never joined the association, and never consented to any of its rules. The room became noticeably quieter. Then I started presenting evidence. Security footage showing repeated trespassing. Copies of county zoning records. Copies of violation notices. Copies of legal threats. Finally, I held up the altered map. "This," I said, "was sent to me as proof that my property belonged to the HOA." Board members immediately started examining their copies. One of them frowned. Another looked confused. Then I showed them the actual county-recorded map. Side by side, the difference was impossible to ignore. The room went silent. Absolute silence. Then I delivered the final blow. "My attorney has already filed a countersuit," I said. "Relevant state agencies have also been notified regarding the documentation used to support these claims." The effect was immediate. Valerie's confidence evaporated. One board member asked her whether she'd verified jurisdiction before issuing fines. Another asked why the rest of the board hadn't been informed. A third asked who authorized legal action against someone outside the HOA. Valerie tried answering. She talked about assumptions. She talked about protecting property values. She talked about misunderstandings. Every answer made things worse. Because the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she had acted almost entirely on her own. One board member, a retired banker named Richard, finally leaned forward and asked a question so simple it completely destroyed her defense. "Did you ever confirm that this property belonged to the association before threatening foreclosure?" Valerie opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Nothing came out. The room already knew the answer. Richard immediately proposed a motion to suspend all actions against me and convene an emergency executive session regarding board conduct. Another member seconded it. The vote was 4-1. Valerie cast the only vote against it. Her authority collapsed right there in front of everyone. I thanked the board for their time and started walking toward the exit. Behind me, the meeting exploded into chaos. Residents were asking questions. Board members were demanding explanations. Valerie sounded less like a president and more like someone trying to explain why she had accidentally driven a car through a living room wall. 3 weeks later, the settlement arrived. The HOA agreed to withdraw every violation, every fine, every threat. They paid my legal fees, which had reached roughly $8,000. They also agreed to compensate me for damages caused by the harassment campaign. More importantly, they formally acknowledged that my property had never been part of their association. As for Valerie, she didn't survive the fallout. The board removed her leadership authority almost immediately. From what I later heard, They considered pursuing action against her personally because of the liability she had created. She resigned before things reached that point. These days life is peaceful again. The workshop is still standing. The tractors are still being restored. The welding torch still throws sparks across the concrete floor every morning. The only real difference is that I now keep cameras everywhere and copies of every important document locked in a fireproof safe. Because once you've watched someone try to rewrite reality with a marker and a stack of fake finds, you stop assuming common sense will protect you. Sometimes you have to protect yourself. And in the end, that's exactly what I did. Looking back now, the money wasn't the biggest victory, not even close. Sure, having the HOA cover my legal bills felt good, and watching every fake find disappear was satisfying, but the real win was something a lot harder to measure. It was knowing that I refused to surrender something my family spent generations building. When those foreclosure threats first arrived, I won't lie to you, I was scared. People love to act tough when they're telling stories after the fact, but fear is real when someone starts throwing legal paperwork around. You begin imagining worst-case scenarios. You start wondering whether some technicality or loophole could somehow take away everything you've worked for. That's exactly why intimidation works so often. Most people aren't afraid of losing arguments. They're afraid of losing time, money, peace, and stability. This is a psychological trap that bullies understand instinctively. They don't always need to win. They just need to convince you that fighting back isn't worth the trouble. Valerie wasn't trying to prove she was right. She was trying to make resistance feel expensive. The lesson here is that authority and legitimacy are not the same thing. Somebody can hold a title, sit behind a desk, wave official-looking paperwork around, and still be completely wrong. According to standard procedure, real authority comes from actual rules, actual laws, and actual jurisdiction, not confidence, volume, or self-importance. That's something I think a lot of people forget. From a legal perspective, property rights, zoning laws, and HOA boundaries exist for a reason. They're supposed to create clarity. The moment people start ignoring those boundaries because they think they know better, everything becomes chaos. What happened to me wasn't really about tractors, welding equipment, or even an HOA. At its core, it was about control. Some people see boundaries and respect them. Other people see boundaries and immediately start looking for ways to cross them. My attorney had an interesting theory after everything ended. He believed Valerie wasn't motivated by property values nearly as much as she was motivated by power. Once someone becomes accustomed to telling people what to do, they sometimes struggle when they encounter someone who simply doesn't belong under their authority. In her mind, my independence wasn't neutral. It was a challenge. The irony is that if she had introduced herself like a normal neighbor, we'd probably be friends today. I would have happily waved from across the property line, talked tractors, shared tools, maybe even helped someone fix a broken fence. Instead, she chose intimidation, and intimidation tends to create exactly the kind of conflict it claims to prevent. The experience also taught me something practical. Document everything. Seriously. Keep records. Save emails. Save letters. Install cameras if necessary. People always think documentation is paranoid until the day they need it. Then suddenly those records become priceless. If I hadn't documented the trespassing, the notices, and the altered map, this story might have ended very differently. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, at what point would you have hired an attorney? Would you have ignored the first fine, the second one, or would you have gone on the offensive immediately? And here's another question that always starts arguments whenever I bring up this story. Do HOAs genuinely help communities more than they hurt them? Or do they sometimes attract people who become a little too comfortable exercising authority over others? Let me know down in the comments because I know people have strong opinions on both sides. As for me, every morning I still walk into that workshop with a cup of coffee in my hand, flip on the lights, and get back to work. The tractors are still there. The tools are still there. The property is still there. And every time I hear the sound of a grinder spinning up or see sparks flying from a welding torch, I'm reminded of something my grandfather used to say: freedom isn't something you keep by accident. It's something you keep because you're willing to stand up for it when somebody tries to take it away.